Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We're excited to have you all here today. We're continuing our webinar series supported by the Federal Highway Administration's Everyday Counts Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian, or STEP program. Today we'll be focusing on methods that agencies can use to proactively assess risk for pedestrians and make systemic improvements to reduce that risk and prevent crashes. Our panelists are going to showcase some new methods for performing systemic safety analysis, as well as two examples demonstrating how local and state agencies can apply these methods in their decision-making. My name is Dan Jeline. I work at the Highway Safety Research Center at UNC, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. Let me introduce you to some of the panelists that we've assembled for today's session. First up is Rebecca Sanders, who is the head of research for tool design, where she specializes in safety analysis and survey design and analysis. She's known for her research on roadway design, roadway user design preferences and perceived and actual safety and mobility for pedestrians and bicyclists, including an investigation into perceived safety and near misses as barriers to bicycling. Rebecca was heavily involved in Seattle's bicycle and pedestrian safety analysis and recently led multiple systemic safety analysis projects in California. Chris Savopoulos is an associate civil engineer for the Seattle Department of Transportation's Vision Zero group. He manages the bicycle and pedestrian safety analysis project, which uses data-driven processes to address how street and signal design influence collision patterns for the most vulnerable roadway users. The results of this work have enabled Seattle to proactively implement countermeasures ahead of developing bicycle or pedestrian collision patterns, enabling the city to work towards zero traffic-related fatalities. We're also joined by Offer Grimbeck, who is a researcher and lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley. He serves as the co-director at the university's Safe Transportation Research and Education Center, or SafeTrek, a research center affiliated with the UC Berkeley School of Public Health and the UC Berkeley Institute of Transportation Studies. As a principal investigator, Offer has obtained multiple sponsored research project awards to study pedestrian and bicycle safety issues and safety management. We're also joined by Rachel Carpenter, who is the Pedestrian and Bicycle Safety Branch Chief with the California Department of Transportation's Division of Traffic Operations. She's responsible for setting the direction and priorities in the establishment of both bicyclist and pedestrian safety improvement programs for the California State Highway System. We're also joined by Rod Brown, who's a senior transportation planner with Fair and Pierce Transportation Consultants. He served as project manager or lead planner on many active transportation plans for cities and counties in California. He has also led work on regional transportation plans, transportation analysis for general plans, and transportation impact assessments. His work has often focused on small cities and rural areas. We're really excited to have this entire panel here with us today to share their experiences and some of the work they're doing to proactively address safety. I have a few items that I'd like to cover for you all. In case you're new to PBIC or STEP webinars, we've got a few housekeeping items to share. You are going to be muted as attendees during the webinar, though you will have the ability to communicate with me by sending in questions that we can pose to our panel at the end of the webinar. We've held about 25 minutes or so for discussion period. So at any point, if you'd like to send in your questions to me, I'll be cataloging those. I'll try to respond to as many as I can, and we'll save some time at the end to answer those questions. We're going to be archiving this webinar on our website. In fact, we've already posted a PDF copy of the slide presentations. I'll send the link out to you all very shortly. If you go to pedbikeinfo.org/webinars, you'll find that archive page there. We'll have the recording posted later today. We're also going to send you a follow-up email just this afternoon with a link to the archive page and some information about how you can generate a certificate of attendance for the webinar. So I want to remind everyone who's joined by other people at your site, if you are the one who registered, you'll get the email. So please be sure to forward that around to your group so that they can also receive that information and generate a certificate of attendance. I'll also note that the webinar was submitted to be considered for 1.5 CM credits. So if you're a planner and used to logging those credits with AICP, please visit their event calendar and log those credits there. We have several other webinars coming up. I'd encourage you to check out our webinars page. There's another one coming up later this month, October 30th, under the STEP program webinars, where we'll talk about the rectangular rapid flashing beacon. So if that's of interest to you, please go ahead and sign up for that webinar and sign up for some of the other ones that we have coming up. Before we get to the presentations, I want to share a little bit of information with you about Everyday Counts and the STEP program specifically, So Everyday Counts is in its 5th round now. It's a way for FHWA to share some really great research and proven countermeasures information with agencies around the country to really enhance the uptake of that information and get those into practice. You can find more information about all the different areas that Everyday Counts operates, but one of them is the STEP program, Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian. You may have been familiar with the guidance that came out earlier this year. It was revised recently to include not just 5, but the 7 countermeasures you see listed on your screen here. So STEP is all about helping agencies figure out how best to identify locations where uncontrolled crossings can be improved with a variety of different countermeasures. The STEP guidance that I'll send you a link to shortly sends you through a step-by-step process that you can use to collect data, inventory your locations, look at crash types, select countermeasures, and deploy them and monitor their outcomes over time. It's really a good step-by-step process for any agency that's interested in improving safety at crossings, but doesn't really know where to start. And at the core of STEP is a really helpful countermeasure selection tool that uses factors like roadway configuration, traffic volumes, and speeds to help agencies understand what are the countermeasures that we would recommend and expect to see used at these types of locations. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the STEP tables that are within the guidance that I'll link to in just a second. I think the valuable connection here is that agencies you can figure out how best to use the STEP guidance to figure out countermeasures, but what we're going to talk about today is a little bit more about how you can think about proactively looking for locations that may not have had a crash history, but may be at risk of crashes happening in the future, using these same countermeasures to address them and improve safety there. Before I hand things over to Rebecca Sanders to lead off the presentations today, I would like to take just a quick poll of the audience to find out how many people are out there today. We'd like to know if it's just you attending the webinar, if you've got a few friends with you, maybe even a larger group. So if you can take a few moments and please cast your vote in this poll, we won't keep it up for very long and we can move right on with our presentation. Just about 30 more seconds for the poll, maybe not even that long. It looks like a lot of folks are voting already. Thank you for doing that. We'll gather a few more bits of input and then we'll be right on our way. Okay. Great. Well, I'm going to close the poll now. I appreciate you all weighing in and responding to that. We are going to send things over to Rebecca Sanders. So Rebecca, keep an eye out on your screen. You should be able to take control and I'll let you know when I see your slides. Okay. You're all set, Rebecca.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being with us today to talk about this really exciting aspect of transportation safety analysis and planning systemic safety. So I want to start today just by giving a very brief overview of systemic safety, and then we'll turn it over to the other panelists to really talk about systemic safety in practice. I'm going to pull today from a couple of major resources, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll have a listing of other resources for you. But this is a definition of systemic safety from NCHRP 1773. That's the recently released guidebook on pedestrian safety, systemic pedestrian safety analysis, or it's not recently released, it's about to come out. I definitely encourage you to look at that. It's an excellent resource, and I'm really excited to have some material from that today. And then also I'll be talking a lot about FHWA's systemic pedestrian or systemic project selection tool today. So systemic safety is an approach to identify high-risk roadway features correlated with specific or severe crash types. It is data-driven, really letting the data drive you to what you prioritize and what you identify as risk factors so that we can start to address the problems network-wide. And that's a key part of this, right, is that we're not, it's different from site analysis in the sense that we're not just looking at specific locations as we have in the past, as we do in hotspot analysis, but we're really looking throughout the network with the idea that we want to start to address problems in the, when they're babies, right, when they're not big problems, or when hopefully before problems even occur. And to do that, we need to look throughout the network to really try to understand where the problems might occur. So this addresses locations with prior crash occurrence. We do use prior crashes to conduct systemic safety analysis, but we also look at similar roadway locations with similar roadway or environmental crash characteristics to those crash locations. And the idea there, again, is that there are things that are happening throughout the system that they're combinations of features that together are more problematic or lead to higher expected crashes or crash locations that we haven't experienced crashes yet, but are likely to experience them in the future. And part of this is developed based on the reality that a lot of crashes occur in low numbers. Systemic safety analysis originated for rural areas where we don't have as many of those high crash locations, and yet we still have severe crashes that are occurring. So the idea was to try to understand, well, what's going on in those places where severe crashes are occurring, and what are the common features between those locations, and how can we start to address those? And then we're now taking that and applying it to pedestrian and bicyclist safety. Because we're looking at risk factors and because we're trying to find those places where crashes are occurring before, where crashes could occur, but before they have occurred, this is considered to be more proactive. And that's a really important tool for us when we're trying to get ahead of crashes, when we're trying to do things like pursue Vision Zero or work towards zero deaths, these major efforts that we have in cities and regions and states that are really trying to get ahead of the problem. This is a tool that's really critical, a potential tool that's really critical to that. And so we're really excited to be able to share some of the results of the on-the-ground work on this today. So let me see how to advance the slide. Sorry about that. So why systemic safety for pedestrians and bicyclists? I've just covered it a little bit, but just to kind of dig in a little deeper, there's a low density of severe crashes for most places for pedestrians and bicyclists that can make prioritization difficult. And so we need to know, how do we start to prioritize those locations when we actually have a lot of ones and twos rather than, you know, 10s or 15s, right? So for motor vehicle crashes, because there are so many more motor vehicles, we tend to have those higher crash locations, and it might be a little bit easier. But for pedestrians and bicyclists, thankfully, we don't have large numbers of high collision locations, but we do have large number of lower collision locations, and that can make prioritization difficult. MAP 21 acknowledges that crash potential is important. So it's not just crash history. And so that's an important thing just to acknowledge, that our other supporting policies, our other major policies and performance measures actually support this direction. This is considered to be supplementary and complementary to site analysis. So it's not replacing hotspot analysis. We still need to look at those high collision locations and address those. But we also want to, again, start to be more proactive and look throughout the network to see where we might prevent and mitigate future crash occurrence. The research indicates that this is really promising. It's still relatively new, so we'll talk a little bit at some point about evaluation. I would just encourage you, if you have the opportunity to do this, to make sure that you include evaluation in your process, because that's important for all of us in the field to be able to build on each other's work and to be able to move forward together. So again, I mentioned the NCHRP 1773 guidebook that's just coming out. This is the process that's outlined there. Similar in some regards to the process that's outlined in FHWA. Again, I'll be talking about both of these today, but mostly FHWA. So a big part of the process is the very beginning. We need to identify the focus crash types and the risk factors. So here we're looking for prevalent severe crash types. We want to identify the factors that are associated with severe crashes. Again, this is largely because we want to make the biggest dent in safety that we can. So we're not focusing on PDOs. There aren't generally a lot of those for pedestrians and bicyclists anyway, but you know, for motor vehicles, the same thing. We really want to try to make a dent where we can, where communities are most affected, and those are the severe crashes, fatal and serious injuries that really have a large societal cost and have a large cost to the community that is impacted. So we're looking for risk factors associated with those, such as higher AEDP, higher numbers of lanes and legs, places where there's a lot of activity. Transit boardings, for example, would indicate that. Also, slope can be an indicator. So I'll talk a little bit more about these things, but we're trying to understand factors we need to be prioritizing. So we need data to do that, right? There's a recommended minimum data. There's also, there are additional data that we would recommend you collect, but we need to understand when we're looking at this, where in the system are these crashes occurring? Are we looking at the state roads? Are we looking at local roads? What are our crash types? And this is really important, again, for selecting the focus crash type. So for pedestrians and bicyclists, oftentimes we're going to need to derive those using multiple variables from the crash data. So for example, we're looking at the motor vehicle action and the bicyclist action. So that might lead us to a crash type that is motor vehicle left turn into bicyclist going in the opposite direction, or motor vehicle driving straight into a pedestrian crossing in the crosswalk. So we need to derive those crash types to really understand where we need to focus. We want to have an understanding of the facility type. This is a proxy, can be a proxy for volumes, but it's also important if you can to analyze them separate from traffic volumes. So understanding, are we talking about crashes that are occurring on the freeway, arterials, collector roads, etc. For freeways and interstates, we don't usually include those in pedestrian and bicyclist analysis, just because most of those crashes actually are occurring on more local roads, but that is not always true. I'm working on an analysis right now with a state that has a very high percentage of pedestrian crashes, pedestrian fatalities on the interstate system. So you need to, use your best judgment for your context to determine where you're going to focus. You can also, as we'll talk about in a minute, you have those crashes that you're looking at on the freeway versus crashes that you're looking at on the local road system. We want to understand crash location type. Are these crashes happening at intersections? Are they happening along segments? Obviously, different types of crashes occur in those places. So really have an understanding of where you're looking, and then location characteristics that are important to consider, such as topography. Again, I mentioned that slope is an important factor for some types of crashes. It's not important for other types of crashes. So having that data to really be able to start to dig in there is really important. Additional recommended data includes traffic volumes. So I mentioned this earlier. Traffic volumes are really important to understand because volumes impact the number of interactions that you have. So you may have a place that looks like a lot of crashes if there are very high volumes, very high pedestrian crossings, really high AADT. You're going to expect there to be more crashes there, and that location may not be quite as dangerous on a risk-based perspective as some other locations, and it's important to have data to be able to discern that. We also want to have data on roadway features like number of lanes, number of medians, intersection features, whether or not there are traffic controls, whether or not, what type of signal timing, etc. So from there, you want to select your focus crash types. So we're looking at things like which crash types did the data show to be the most severe, fatal, and or serious. We also want to understand, are there crash types that maybe aren't the most severe, but are disproportionately severe for the number of crashes that occur. We also may want to look at the crashes that are the most prevalent. Some of this is going to be driven by the numbers that you have, your sample size, and so you may not always have the luxury of looking at just the most severe crashes. You may need to look at more crashes. So trying to understand, are there crashes that are occurring, injury crashes that are occurring in high numbers that may not top the charts in terms of severe crashes, but actually are still really important to understand. This is also a particularly important point for pedestrian and bicyclist crashes just in general, because we know that those crashes tend to be underreported. And some really interesting research that's come out of San Francisco with regard to their high injury network has found that 30 to 40% of moderate injury crashes are misclassified, and severe injury crashes are misclassified. So it's important to at least consider those when you're thinking about how to choose your focus crash types. You can also look to other emphasis areas and other plans like a highway safety improvement program, but be aware of limitations and applicability. For example, those programs obviously have to be statewide, and in urban areas in particular, you may not be quite as representative of the problems that you have in your urban areas, specifically with regard to pedestrians and bicyclists. So from there, we want to select the focus facilities, and I want to take just a minute here to make the point that, as Chris is going to talk about, it's really an amazing opportunity if you have the data to develop safety performance functions for your city or for your area. If you have the data to be able to do that, you can really hone in on things that may be specific to your area. So for example, topography is going to be a bigger issue in places like Seattle and San Francisco than in places like Kansas, right? So how do you, take into account those sort of more local characteristics? If you have the data to develop your own safety performance functions like we were able to do for Seattle, that is what I would consider to be best practice. But that is also not possible for a lot of places. We don't have the network-wide volumes that we would like to have, particularly for pedestrians and bicyclists. In many places, we're lacking other fundamental data in many places. So I'm going to talk from the rest of the presentation on mostly about if you don't have the ability to do your own safety performance functions, then these are still tools that you can use. But I did want to put it out there that if you have the ability to do the safety performance, I think that's an excellent way to really get some location-specific crash risk understanding. So to select focus facilities, you can use crash trees to identify the problem locations. So for example, you can look at things like, are we looking at more urban areas, more rural areas in terms of crash prevalence? We're looking at arterials versus collectors versus locals, dividing by intersections versus segments, higher speed versus lower speeds. This example on the right here is from New York State. They actually looked at undivided versus divided roads and number of lanes, and then they looked at speed, and you may be able to see that there are a few boxes that are a little bit outlined, suggesting that those are the combination of risk factors that they found to be really associated with crashes in a way that they want to investigate further. So from there, we want to identify and evaluate risk factors. This is identifying characteristics common between the select crash types and the focus facility. So again, we want to focus on features more likely to be associated with severity when possible, but obviously taking your entire database and your entire crash database into consideration and understanding the needs you might have for sample size as well. If needed, look to research your best practice to identify those known risk factors. So I'll give some resources in a minute about this, but we have a lot of understanding that higher traffic volumes, higher traffic speeds, number of lanes, things like that tend to be associated with higher numbers of crashes. So we want to be able to take that information about risk factors to help prioritize. And that is this next step, which is screening and prioritizing candidate locations. So once you have an understanding of your focus crash types and you have an understanding of your focus locations, you then want to screen and prioritize the candidate locations throughout the network that have those crash types or the of those crash types that have those combinations of factors that you've identified. So if you don't have a safety performance function, you're going to use your crash history and your weighted risk factors to identify the priority locations. If you do have a safety performance function, and there are safety performance functions that are coming out with NCAP 1784 for pedestrians and bicyclists, there are safety performance functions for motor vehicles currently in the Highway Safety Manual, then you can apply those safety performance functions to your network and you can get an understanding of where crashes are predicted to occur. And then best practice would be to use an empirical based combination of your predicted crashes and the crashes, just recognizing that safety performance functions aren't perfect, data sets are never perfect, so crash history is a valuable tool still in understanding where we would want to treat locations. From there, we want to select countermeasures, and the idea here is that with a systemic program, we're trying to address a large number of locations that have lower crash numbers, right? So we're not replacing high collision location analysis. That is a separate thing, and oftentimes those high collision locations really do need a lot of countermeasures or a lot of revision, and so may need a lot of funding. In this case, we're trying to do a lot of locations, and so we need the funding per location to be lower. So we're looking for low cost countermeasures that we can deploy widely. And we have a lot of great countermeasure resources out there. I've just got a few little snapshots down here at the bottom, a couple from various states, a couple from FHWA or NHTSA, but I encourage you to look at state resources in your state as well, because you may have some state-specific countermeasure guidance that would be important to be aware of. And from there, we want to prioritize our projects. So the nice thing about this is that your results can be used within other frameworks. So this is an example of how we might use prioritization within, for example, a council district. So we could say, okay, within this district, we want to prioritize these 10, or within this neighborhood, we want to do these 5 or what have you. But we can also use this to build on other transportation plans, all of our areas and all of our efforts that we do for our pedestrian bicyclist plans or for regional transportation plans. The results from systemic safety analysis can really be used to help contextualize those plans and contextualize rankings that may already exist. And Chris is going to talk, I think, a lot more about that and how they use that in Seattle. So from there, just with the systemic process, we want to identify funding for the program and implement it, looking at things like what are our agency goals and priorities, which funding sources exist that could support what we're trying to do here, and then how can our identified needs be built into existing efforts. Again, this is similar to the prioritization slide, that we want to, as much as we can, piggyback on other efforts that are already out there. So if you have projects that you've identified and they happen to coincide with projects that have been identified through other plans, that is opportunity for strategy, right? So looking into the various ways that you can make those things happen, and then also understanding what funding sources exist and what might be able to be supported through those funding sources regarding what you've found to be problems in your community. From there, we want to perform a systemic program evaluation. And I mentioned this in the beginning, This is so important, not only for future support for your work or your agency's work, but also for broader professional knowledge. Again, we're still actually in a fairly new part of this, particularly with regard to pedestrians and bicyclists, and we all need to learn from each other and help each other as we're moving forward, really all with the same goal of dramatically improving pedestrian and bicyclist safety in this country. So to do this, you want to roll up the data and make sure that you're including at least 3 years of crash data. I didn't talk about this earlier, but crashes do tend to move around over time. So it's important not to just look at 1 year or 2 years, because there's quite a risk that those could be anomalies. You might see a dramatic increase in 1 year, and then the next 2 years actually might show something different. And so we want to make sure that we're using at least 3 years of crash data when we're performing these evaluations. We also want to make sure that we're including changes in other key risk factors. So if you have a situation where you have put in, let's say you put in a pipeline and your crashes go up, but go up a little bit, but your volumes triple or quadruple, that's critical information to include in an evaluation, because the risk has actually likely gone down. And so if we're just looking at crashes, we're really not getting the full picture, and we might actually be drawing the wrong conclusions. You can also look at metrics like cost-benefit analysis to prioritize, although just to be aware that those don't always account for benefits for pedestrians and bicyclists as well as we might like them. So that's a high-level overview. I know that was quick, and I apologize for that, but we want to make sure that you have time to get to hear on-the-ground work. Some resources for systemic safety analysis listed here. So we've got, again, this FHWA project selection tool. The Highway Safety Manual is an excellent resource. The NCHRP 1773 guidebook, and then, as I mentioned earlier, NCHRP 1784. Throwing a lot of numbers out there, but that's an effort that will be producing SPFs for the Highway Safety Manual specific to pedestrians and bicyclists, and offer, if you want to, if there's anything you want to say about that in your presentation, that would be great. And then we also have a forthcoming guidebook on pedestrian and bicyclist safety at intersections for NCHRP 1563 that will offer a high-level sort of overview of the various types of safety analysis and provides an excellent resource for countermeasures. And then the Highway Safety Improvement Program Manual. And these are just a few. There are other resources out there, and I encourage you to look around, and certainly feel free to contact me or others in this presentation if you have questions. I just want to end with contacts for EDC 5-step. Thank you to Dan for giving that introduction. If you have questions about this program, please do contact your state DOT or your local FHWA regional representative, because they're there to help you, and they want to help you be able to take advantage of these resources. So please do contact these folks or your local folks, and there are a lot of people that are out there that want to do everything they can to help you take pedestrian and bicyclist safety to the next level in your community. So with that, I am done. I think I'm going to turn it over to Chris, or maybe turn it back to Dan to turn it over to Chris. And Dan, I think, are we holding questions for the end?
Sounds great. Yeah, thanks so much, Rebecca. Take questions toward the end. I've already got a few, so please continue to send those in if you have them. I'm going to move the screen right now to our presenter from Seattle, Chris, to share some information about how Seattle is taking this and making some decisions and changes based on it. So Chris, I see your slides. If you can, I actually see your notes version. If you go to the display settings and swap view, that should give us the right slide. And you're all set whenever you're ready, Chris.
All right. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name's Chris Philopoulos. I work with the Seattle Department of Transportation, and I'm here to present the bicycle and pedestrian safety analysis that we published 2 years ago, which is an application of a lot of the methodologies that Rebecca just talked about. So to give you a brief background on Seattle, Seattle is a Vision Zero city, and we are targeting 0 severe or fatal collisions by 2035. We are definitely making progress on that, but as you can see here, Seattle population has been booming as of late. We're adding about 15 to 20,000 people per year. We are definitely focusing on the severe and fatal collision counts that we have in the city, but also we need to focus on the rates because it's a little bit of an uphill battle as the city expands. During this time, as you can see, our citywide collision rates have been on a steady decrease. There was a slight tick up in 2016, but we've generally been seeing that our collisions per trips have been going down pretty steadily over the years. Our severe and fatal collision counts are also going down, but a lot of this we can attribute to vehicle and driver safety. There's been a lot of progress made on vehicle safety, especially in the engineering side of things, and a lot of our policies in the city that have been targeting vehicle collisions. And so as of that, our vehicle severe and fatal collision counts have been drastically reduced along the same time. Unfortunately, our bicycle and pedestrian roadway users are still prevalent in both of those categories, even though bicycle and pedestrian collisions only make up about 6% of our total crashes through this time. They make about 40% of our fatalities and 50% of our severe injury collisions during this time. And along with that, we've seen that about 9 out of 10 reported bicycle or pedestrian collisions do result in some form of injury. So they are obviously our most vulnerable roadway users. And as a city that's on the Vision Zero track, we've decided that we need to start focusing more on that group for safety improvements. So a few years ago, we kicked off the bicycle and pedestrian safety analysis. The purpose of this was to better understand the risk factors that contribute to pedestrian and bicycle collisions, not just severe and fatal, but we do want to prioritize those as those are part of the metric that we're tracking. Historically, our Vision Zero program has been reactive to collision patterns. We have a high collision program and we have, fatal reaction programs, but we found that being reactive is not enough to treat the collision patterns that we're seeing with bikes and peds throughout the city. So the purpose of the BPSA is to be a little more proactive and systemically address collisions that we see throughout the city, not only to treat known collision patterns, but also to mitigate the potential for collision patterns that target bicycles and pedestrians. And in doing so, as I said, this advances our goals of reaching zero severe or fatal collisions by 2035. So for the BPSA, we looked at 8 years of collision data from 2007 to 2014. These were any bicycle or pedestrian collisions that were reported to the Seattle Police Department so that we could have consistency in our reporting. At a glance, you can see here that we had about almost 7,000 bicycle and pedestrian collisions during this time versus 120,000 total collisions. So bicycle and pedestrian collisions accounted for roughly 6% of the total collisions, but 50% of our severe collisions and 40% of our fatal collisions. And the rates therein, we see that 12% of all pedestrian collisions are either severe injury or fatal collisions, and for bicycles, it's closer to 8%. From there, we just wanted to look at what the trends looked like by count. And so as you can see here, from 2007 to 2014, we've seen a steady increase in the count of bicycle collisions. However, the severe and fatal injury counts have been relatively stagnant. It's worth pointing out that in 2007 is when Seattle adopted our first bicycle master plan, and that would be the point where we started aggressively installing not only bicycle lanes, but buffered and physically separated cycle tracks, major separation bicycle facilities. And so there was a little bit of growing pains when drivers and pedestrians got used to the idea of having more bicycles in the roadway. But as a result of that, we've seen that the growing pains have passed. Our bicycle ridership is actually very high. And so when we talk about the actual bicycle collision rates throughout the city, they have been on a steady decline. So since 2006, it looks like we've had a 40% reduction in our bicycle collisions per 1,000 bicycle commuters. A big portion of that is probably safety numbers, but also best engineering practices for what we are installing. Over that same period, you can see that pedestrian collision trends aren't as smooth to present. There's some anomalies that we see every year with bicycles and pedestrians, but pedestrians are especially exacerbated. It's a little less predictable for pedestrian collisions in the city, but we're still averaging about 450 pedestrian collisions per year, of which about 50 are severe or fatal. But once again, as the city is booming, the rates are actually going down pretty drastically. So we've seen about a 25% reduction in pedestrian-involved collisions per 100,000 residents in the city. A lot of this is because of vast improvements to the walkability within the city, but also heavy improvements in transit usage in the city. So we see a lot more people that are choosing to walk or bike to work or wherever they're going rather than driving. Having looked at those trends, we started looking at how these collision patterns actually interact with our road network as a whole. And the main takeaway from this is that we see about 75% of our bike collisions and 80% of our pedestrian collisions are happening on arterial streets. If you follow the x-axis on this graph, you can see that as arterial classification goes down, we see the total number of bicycle and pedestrian collisions going down and the severe and fatal share of those collisions by count going down as well. And the big telling point here is that over 70% of our road miles in the city are non-arterial residential streets, but they're only accounting for about 25% of our bicycle and 20% of our pedestrian collisions. So it guides us to see that even though we can see severe or fatal collisions not on our arterial streets, it behooves us to spend a little bit more of our analysis looking at the actual larger arterials where we would expect that, higher vehicle volumes, higher vehicle speeds, more conflict points might lead us into higher collision counts, but also higher severity of those collisions. Moving on, we actually looked at the collision types for each of the modes that we were now analyzing. What we wanted to do was look at collision types, which is something that Rebecca brought up earlier. Seattle bins our collision types into broad categories, and then from there that helps us actually look for statistically significant trends in those collision types. So this is the top 3 most prevalent bicycle collision types during that 8-year period, as well as their share of the severe and fatal injuries at that time. From a hotspot or high collision location standpoint, we don't really see left hook collisions occurring with bicycles as frequently as you might expect, but actually looking at the entire system, we see that they account for approximately 14% of the total and over a fifth of the severe and fatal collisions that we saw during this time. Afterwards, we have the angle collisions, which are effectively when yielding to the right-of-way or failing to yield to road controls is an issue. We expected that would be higher, but they actually account for a little less than 10% of the total and about 10% of our severe and fatal. And then we have the right hook collision type, which is 2 vehicles traveling in the same direction, or a vehicle and a bicycle, and then the vehicle turning in front of a bicycle. This is usually overrepresented in our high collision location approaches, but we can see that it's only about 7% of the total and less than 3% of our severe and fatal collisions occurring with that collision type. We also called out dooring here because we hear a lot of concerns about dooring in the city, especially with the way that our bicycle master plan interacts with road design. However, we found that they only account for about 5% of the total and only about 6% of our severe and fatal. This caught us off guard because if you've ever been involved in a dooring collision, they're a little traumatic, and so they get very over-reported. But with that in mind, they don't make up as much of the total collisions from the data set that we were looking at. Along with that on the right, we just looked at what type of location bicycle collisions were occurring at. We split it intersections, and then the other would be non-intersections, so mid-block or driveways. And we see that about 60% of our bicycle collisions are occurring at intersections. And Rebecca also pointed out that slope is a big factor in bicycle collisions, especially for Seattle, where we have a lot of hills. A lot of that is associated with slopes being contributory to bicycle speeds, and speeds, of course, interact negatively with the severity of an injury. So we just wanted to call that out. But looking back at the dooring incidents, we found that 5% of these collisions, 5% of all bicycle collisions were dooring collisions. But when we looked at the lanes that bicyclists were using, you can see that if a bicyclist is just occupying a curb lane in the middle, that's almost half of our dooring collisions. Whereas as you move up in the predictability of a bicycle facility, so sharrows on the right or a bike lane on the left, we see a dramatic reduction in dooring collisions for bicyclists. And that speaks to the idea that we can engineer around vehicle users in parking lanes to help them predict the prevalence of bicyclists in the area to reduce collisions and reduce the severity of those collisions. When moving on to pedestrians, we saw that about 29% of our pedestrian collisions were vehicles turning left across pedestrians at controlled intersections. This only happens in locations where we have permissive lefts or when we have issues with pedestrian crossing times. So seeing that called out to the top, we were not expecting that because we see so frequently that angle collisions are actually contributing to our severe and fatal pedestrian collisions. And so right angle at controlled intersections was our second most prevalent, and our third most would be angle collisions at mid-block in uncontrolled crossings. This is something that we've seen very prevalently. That's about a fifth of all of our total collisions, but they're very random and hard to predict. As such, they accounted for a third of our severe and fatal collisions at this time. And on the right, you can see that 70% of our pedestrian collisions were occurring at intersections and 30% are either in driveways and mid-block, which drew us to look at exactly where in the street network we're seeing these types of collisions. Even though only a little over half of our bicycle collisions are occurring at intersections, 70% of our pedestrian collisions are occurring at intersections. Part of that's to be expected because the road network is designed to funnel people, especially pedestrians, to intersections for crossing purposes, but it also speaks to the amount of exposure that's occurring at those locations. Furthermore, if we looked at whether an intersection was signalized or not, we saw that a signalized intersection is actually less prevalent for bicycles to be struck, and on top of that, the severity of those collisions drops from the 12% average severe fatal rate to 7%, whereas with pedestrians, when they are at a traffic signal, they have a 2/3 chance of being struck there versus at an unsignalized intersection, and also the severity of those collisions goes up. So rather than assuming that intersections were the problem here, we decided that we also needed to take exposure into account. And so exposure is just the level of pedestrian or bicycle activity at a given area. For the first round of the BPSA, we wanted to create our own sort of trip generation based exposure model for pedestrians and bicycles. For pedestrians, we used what annualized count data we had available, and then we also had a trip generation model to supplement that. But at the time, we had a very limited amount of bicycle volume or pedestrian volume and counts throughout the city at that time. Whereas with bicycles, we did use the annualized count data and the trip generation modeling, but we also used Strava, which is an opt-in GPS tracking app that bicyclists can use. That data was available to us to see where bicyclists who were opting in were riding in the city. And along with that, we also have our GIS, geospatial bicycle network that tells us where bike lanes are, so we can predict at what locations bicyclists would probably prefer to be using. As this was an initial cut at this exposure model, you can see on the left where we expect the most pedestrian activity to be occurring, and this is relatively accurate from a predictive stance. A lot of our pedestrian activity is focused in the downtown and some of our urban villages, but when overlaid with the actual reported pedestrian collisions over that 8-year period, we see that we're missing a few key locations throughout the city where pedestrian collisions are occurring at a rate that the exposure model is not accounting for. Whereas when taking the bike exposure model into account, you can see it's much more robust because there's much more data sets taken in. And so when overlaid with the bicycle collisions that were reported during this period, we're catching a lot more. Having looked at the collision types and the locations and how they interact, we then moved forward with the help of Tool and HSRC to do a multivariate analysis. This took into account the reported bicycle and collision during this time, as well as the exposure and count data we had for bicycles and pedestrians. It took into account roadway design, which would be things like width, lane types that were available, lane counts, slope, speeds, volumes, as well as signal design, demographic information and how the demographics of a specific area of the city can influence how bicycles and pedestrians use certain intersections and how collisions might develop from there. The built environment, which talks about not only what an area around an intersection is and how it's used and how that influences safety, but also just trip generation in general. Transit opportunities for bicycles and pedestrians, which drives the exposure model greatly. Locations where we are interested in investing more in lighting or have invested more in lighting and seeing how that influences bicycle and pedestrian collision patterns, and also just geographic information such as slope, directionality, road consistency, things like that. All of those were run through a multivariate analysis to see what is statistically significant from those and how they interact with collision patterns. And from there, we were able to identify the risk factors therein. We found 16 different risk factors that could be modeled statistically significantly for the purposes of this analysis. And through those risk factors, we were able to generate safety performance factors for every location in the city that we wanted to evaluate. So based on our first exploratory analysis and the results of that multivariate analysis, we agreed that we wanted to focus our model on intersection locations as they account for the majority of our collisions and are overstating for severe and fatal rates for pedestrians. We found that mid-block collisions were, like I said, a little bit more random for bicycles and pedestrians, but on top of that, there's a bit more order to how intersections operate based on the design itself. So we wanted to focus on that for our first run. We also decided to prioritize 5 collision types that we were interested in. The first 2 are just any bicycle and pedestrian collision available. Along with that, we wanted to look at the top 2 bicycle collision types by total share and also the severe and fatal rates, which would be the opposite direction bicycle collisions, usually left hooks, and the right angle bicycle collisions. And then our 5th model type would be the right angle pedestrian collisions. That is regardless of controls. We found that of our 15,500 intersections, signalized intersections were not enough on their own to be their own data set. So we decided that we would just evaluate every intersection in the city based on that collision type to see how the SPS pull out. So after having run that, how are we using these findings? The first thing we're doing is identifying the locations where street or signal design changes may be needed. This is not a reactive approach, I would say, but it is data-driven. So based on the results of the first round of SPF models, we can say that there are certain roadway designs that contribute so heavily to bicycle and pedestrian collision patterns that we would like to prioritize those design changes over other things. Along with that, when we do make these decisions, we want to prioritize what we can get the most cost-effective improvements at locations in order to mitigate not only existing but also potential future crashes. So we have effectively wrapped the BPSA's analysis into all of our Vision Zero programs, where if a project is going through an area that the BPSA calls out based on the safety performance factor outputs, it can suggest either improvements or at least a minimum standard of design to take bicycle and pedestrian safety into account that might go beyond what is warranted by, say, the MUTCD design guidelines. In talking about the data, we've had a lot of municipalities reach out to us and talk about how they can do this type of analysis on their own, and we've always looped back to the idea that having good data is probably the #1 resource that you need. Thankfully, Seattle has a fatal collision rate that is incredibly low. It's one of the safest cities in the country, at least for a city our size. We have the same fatality rate per capita that Sweden does, or New York, although they have many, many more people available to them. So from that, it's really appreciative from a Vision Zero standpoint that we have so few fatal collisions, but from a statistical analysis point, we do have a limited amount of severe and fatal collisions that we can work off of to increase the value of the analysis. So instead, we had to focus on the quality of the collision data that we are basing our analysis off of. We have decided that from a qualitative standpoint, only working with Seattle Police Department reported collisions allows for consistency in our collision database, so everything can be compared apples to apples. We do understand that we could expand the quantity of our collisions by involving other data sets, including, when Seattle Fire Department sends an ambulance out to treat a pedestrian or bicycle collision, but the actual quality of that data was not up to par with what we were working with. So first and foremost, if a municipality can identify a high quality and consistent collision database, that's probably the hardest thing to do. But if that's available, then this sort of analysis kind of lends itself to being valuable for identifying potential collision patterns. Along with that, just looking at geospatial data, both on the local and systemic trends analyses, allows you to look at beyond what the reactive sort of high collision approach would inform you as to what the actual concerns are for bicycle and pedestrian safety. By looking at things on a systemic level, you can identify that there are trends that exist beyond just specific locations, but also how the area around a location interacts with bicycle and pedestrian safety. Along with that, just statistical analysis enough can help you weed out what sort of analyses you do or do not want to focus on for your first runs. And along with that, as stated by Rebecca and myself, understanding exposure for bicycles and pedestrians is really the key to understanding the risk at a given location and how a design influences that. And then it also allows for prioritizing specific safety improvements based on the exposure at a location. And this slide used to say next steps, but I'm happy to announce that the phase 2 of our BPSA kicked off last month. As part of that, we're going to be adding 3 additional years of collision data. We are going to be evaluating new collision types for safety performance factors and reevaluating the existing safety performance factor outputs. We're going to be developing a much more robust exposure model for both bicycles and pedestrians based off of a exposure model that DataKind was willing to create for us for vehicle exposure. And we are also going to be investing heavily in video analysis for how bicycle facilities interact with vehicle movements throughout the city so that we can better inform our bicycle master plan on what types of facilities to develop in the future. And of course, whenever we find that we don't have a engineering solution to a developing bicycle or pedestrian issue, we can always use the results of the BPSA to promote education and enforcement throughout the city. And I do believe that is my presentation. So thank you very much, and I will hand it back to Dan.
All right, thank you so much, Chris. We'll keep rolling with another case study example that we have from California, and then we'll get into our discussion and some questions. So keep sending those questions in if you have them. Offer, the screen is coming to you, and I'll let you know when I see your screen, and we'll go from there. Okay, you're all set, Offer. Please take it away. And I believe actually Rachel will be starting things out.
Right. Thanks, Dan. Good morning, everyone, or I suppose good afternoon for those on the East Coast. As Dan mentioned, I'm Rachel Carpenter, and I oversee pedestrian and bicyclist safety at Caltrans. We're really excited to be here to have the opportunity to present our work on a forthcoming pedestrian safety related systemic program for California. And today I'm fortunate to be joined by Offer Grembeck at UC Berkeley SafeTrack, as well as Rod Brown with Farron Piers. So in the next 20 minutes or so, we'll provide an overview of the first round of our pedestrian safety improvement monitoring pilot program. It's a mouthful. We'll share the details on the research that SafeTrack completed related to developing really a framework for a pedestrian systemic safety program. Then we'll finish our presentation by describing our ongoing work to develop and finalize this pedestrian-related systemic program. Next slide. So in 2006, we developed and implemented our first round of the Pedestrian Safety Improvement Monitoring Program, and we did implement it as a pilot. The purpose was to identify and address pedestrian-related high collision concentration locations, or spot locations, really with the long-term goal of substantially reducing pedestrian fatalities and injuries on the California state highway system. So as you see in the map on the right, we completed traffic safety investigations at 129 pedestrian-related hotspots to determine probable cause and to identify potential countermeasures to reduce collisions involving pedestrians. We required status updates on the 129 investigations in order to ensure that our district traffic safety staff was progressing along on their investigations. All the investigations were completed in March of 2017. Next slide. We also required our traffic safety staff to take pedestrian safety trainings to ensure that they had the needed knowledge to perform their investigations. They learned effective solutions and best practices in the design and operation of pedestrian safety. Moving on, Offer. One more slide, or one more click. We had 2 pedestrian safety trainings, one in Sacramento and one in the Bay Area. And we're planning to provide 3 future trainings at this point as we work to expand our pedestrian safety program. Next slide. So round 1 of our hotspot-based pedestrian monitoring program resulted in 29 capital projects, 54 maintenance work orders, and 6 really quick turnaround safety actions, sort of like signal timing tweaks, very quick projects. What you see in the table is the results of that first round. To date, the dominant strategy really used by most state agencies, state departments of transportation to allocate safety resources is the hotspot approach. And that's the approach that we used for the first round of our pedestrian safety program. Although it focuses on identifying recommendations, at hotspots, you can see that it resulted in quite a few pedestrian-related improvements. While the hotspot approach is reactive in the sense that it focuses on sites that have already experienced collisions, the systemic approach employs reactive and proactive components like you've been hearing. At Caltrans, we feel that it's necessary to develop and refine and expand our pedestrian safety program, really to address not only the spot locations, but also expand our program to identify systemic pedestrian safety problems that would benefit from blanket improvements throughout the state. And in order to develop this reactive or hotspot, as well as proactive systemic pedestrian safety program, we're very fortunate to receive assistance from Berkeley and Fair & Peers. Alfred?
Thank you, Rachel. So building on what Rachel described, so our task was to develop a systemic approach that can be applied at the state level. So it's a challenge that's a little bit different from the one that was described for Seattle, because we want to make sure that we have a framework that can be applied in a somewhat equitable manner across the state, and to develop a tool and an approach that can support a program that can then be scalable, consistent, and can be done or applied at the desired frequency to see how things are evolving. So when we started this, we were trying to think, where does systemic safety fit in on this continuum of reactive to proactive? And and all the way on the left-hand side are the more reactive approaches, and as Rachel described, that's mostly the spot approaches, and we consider it reactive because spot approaches are considering or prioritizing investigations and safety improvements only at places that crashes have already occurred. So it's reactive because it responds to a specific crash or set of crashes that happened at a specific location. When we move along this continuum and think about corridor approaches, so to some extent or conceptually, they are like a big spot. So it's a series of intersections or a highway segment that has higher than expected number of crashes. But it's a little bit less reactive because in addition to the locations within that corridor that have had crashes, the improvements, if they're applied, kind of blanket improvements across the corridor, might also be implemented in locations where a crash has not happened yet. So it is more on the reactive side, but it's less. It also has a proactive component to it, because you can also make improvements in locations that have not experienced the crash yet. When we move further towards the middle and we're thinking about systemic safety, so similar to what Rebecca described and Chris talked about, when we're thinking about systemic safety, we're identifying locations that suffer from a specific type of crash. So it's no longer that needs to be spatially within a corridor or a specific spot. It's more a specific facility attributes or attributes of a location in combination with a specific crash type. So when we think about systemic, we're placing it somewhere in the middle between reactive and proactive, because it uses historical crash data to identify priorities. So it's reactive to things that have happened, but it allows us to make improvements also at many locations that either have a low crash frequency or crash rate, or even no crashes at all. So we are using historical data to make improvements that are targeting a specific type of crash at locations that we know have a sensitivity or are suffering from that type of crash. And that's where we're placing it, somewhere in the middle on this continuum. When we move all the way to the right, we have more aspirational approaches like Vision Zero or Safe Systems, and they are as proactive as it gets, because the underlying goal there is to build a system on which no one can be severely or fatally injured on, and that's always the effort and that's always the desire. and it's very proactive in that sense, because you can even continue doing that, or you need to keep on continuing to do that even when you get to 0 deaths. So our approach is very similar to FHWA systemic safety program, and similar to what Rebecca described. So we're showing here again the different elements, and more specifically, we're showing here the tasks that are under element 1. The first task being selecting the focus crash types, and task 2, the focus facilities. And what we wanted to do, we wanted to use these principles, but to do it in a maybe slightly different sequence. So instead of doing it as 2 tasks or 2 sequential tasks, we're doing it simultaneously. So we're generating a matrix that the different rows of the matrix represent different crash types, similar to what we would have in task 1 of FHWA's tool. So then again, the rows would be different crash types. So it can be a pedestrian crossing and crosswalk in combination with a failure to yield. So there can be, or the different crash types even that Chris described, if you have that level of detail in your data. And then the columns, similar to task 2 of FHWA's approach, they represent the facility types, so the location types. And again, the type of variables that you can use to describe that are similar to what we'll describe to what Rebecca and Chris talked about. So it can be the control of the intersection, it can be the number of lanes, it can be some information about ADT, and so on. So then by combining the crash types and the facility types, we get like a little snapshot. Right now it's all blank, but we'll show you in a second what it would look like. We're getting a snapshot of what type of crashes are happening on what type of facilities, and it provides a transparent picture of the systemic safety in the jurisdiction of interest. In this next slide, we're presenting 6 matrices that were developed using this concept. This was done for a local agency, and we're using it here to demonstrate that it's not just one single matrix. So you can have a matrix for vehicles, or for pedestrians and for bicycles, and you can do it at different parts of your network and focus just on the intersection footprint, or maybe the intersection influence area. Here we also have matrices for mid-blocks, and it's hard to see the details here, but if you try to look at the different matrices, they have this color code in there that we're going to use later on also, where red and yellow represent specific combinations of rows and columns, in other words, crash types and crash locations that have a higher number of in this case it's frequency, higher number of crashes, and the greens represent a very low frequency, and the white represents no crashes at all. But from that, what you can see, if you look at the different matrices, that they tell slightly different stories about what type of crashes are happening where, as it relates to these different combinations of location and mode. So moving on to talking about how, what is the process, or how to set up such a systemic approach. And again, our underlying goal was to come up with something that then can be used as a framework to identify systemic priorities for Caltrans at the district level or at some other resolution. So we wanted something that's scalable, but also something that's consistent and can be done at a certain frequency, every 2 years, every 3 years, as desired. So the setup includes 2 steps. The first one is to define the structure of the matrix. In other words, it just means picking the rows and the columns. And then the second step is to start priming some of the potential countermeasures that would apply for a specific cell of the matrix. So when we're talking about the structure of the matrix, the first thing that we need to do is to determine what are the matrices of interest. As I showed in that example from that local agency, you can have it across different modes. You can have it for intersections or highway segments. You can break it down by rural, urban, maybe even a level of severity of the crash. And what we're showing here is that, again, this approach can be applied for these different type of matrices, and in collaboration with the agency, it can be tailored to the needs, and it is of course limited by the data that's available. So in this specific presentation, we'll be focusing much more on an intersection matrix that was developed for the California State Highway System, and the process to determine the rows and columns is based on several things. It's more of an iterative process where you use all of the detail that you have about the crash type. In this case, we use pedestrian movement in combination with a primary collision factor together to define what is the crash type. And again, it was an iterative process to narrow down what combinations it would have. But in addition to the expert-based process, there are also some performance measures that we're using to make sure that the matrix has some efficiency to it in terms of blank cells and some other attributes. And similarly for the columns, again, we're limited by the data that's available, and we're exploring different combinations of control, a number of lanes, ADT, and some other attributes until the combination of rows and columns generates a matrix that's agreeable by the agency and the researcher. The second part of the setup is the countermeasure matrix. And once we have the structure of the rows and columns, what we did in this specific case, we looked at all of the countermeasures that are available for Caltrans regarding pedestrian safety, and we analyzed each of them individually to see where and when would they apply. And then using that information, we were able to pre-filter for each cell of this matrix what are the countermeasures that are the potential choice set for investigators if that specific cell becomes a priority. So in this table, it's kind of a snapshot of how it was done. But when we roll all of that into the matrix, we get all of these numbers inside the cell, and each number represents the list of potential countermeasures that would be pertinent, that would apply for that specific crash type, location type. And in this case, green represents a higher number, yellow represents a lower number. The second phase is screening. So after we have the basic structure of the matrix and we know the countermeasures that apply, so we need to determine what types of crashes are happening on what type of facilities to give us this systemic snapshot, followed by a technique to identify the systemic concerns and priorities that will then be passed on to the district practitioners to consider for investigations. So when we're populating the crash matrix, in this case, this is a matrix for intersections, given the rows and the columns that we looked at before. And you can immediately see that you have here some sort of story, some sort of picture regarding what type of crashes are happening on what type of facilities. And it's hard to put this on a slide so that people can actually see the full picture, but also also read it. But what we're seeing in this specific example is that pedestrian crashes at intersection, crossing at the crosswalk with a primary collision factor of failure to yield was a systemic concern on two different types of facilities, one being unsignalized, with the primary being more than 3 lanes, secondary road 3 lanes or less, and then with a specific combination of ADT for the primary and secondary. And then another type of facility that suffers from that crash is signalized, again, with the specific combination of laneage and ADT. And this is done for all of the California state highway system. And what this allows us is to run this also at for specific districts, as was said before, but also to slice it by other categories. Here, we're just showing a few examples of what it looks like when it's sliced for District 4, which is an urban district. And in this one, the result is similar to what we saw for when it was done across the state, because it's also a big district. But if you look at District 7, that's LA, we suddenly get a slightly different picture, a lot more emphasis on signalized intersections for a specific combination of laneage and ADT that are suffering from that. And that can be a starting point for the district to say, oh, we want to focus on this type of crash at facilities that have these attributes. And it gives the agency a traction of what systemic concern they want to focus at. If we look at a different district, District 10, that's more rural, so suddenly the systemic priority or the systemic concern is now much more on the unsignalized side, and it's for also for intersections that have a lower laneage, so more narrow intersections with lower ADT, which is what is expected for these type of districts. So after we generated these snapshots, and again, that was just for intersections, then the next step is to decide from these, where do you do the cutoff? What from these cells are the cells that you want to focus on? And we're not going to go into much detail how it's done here, but as always, there is this trade-off between a more inclusive approach that you want to cover multiple concerns within your network versus a more restrictive approach. You say, hey, we want to focus on something very specific, or we want to allocate our resources just for the top concern. I do want to add another comment regarding non-engineering countermeasures. So here we're very focused, and we're talking about, and the application is for design improvements, but the same structure and the same approach under various circumstances can also be used to identify non-engineering improvements that can apply for that specific crash type. In this example, a failure to yield for a specific type of facility. So following up on how to actually identify these systemic concerns, so we're applying some statistics on the data, and then we're able to pinpoint and say this is one of several systemic concerns that then are being passed on to the practitioners for consideration or for further investigation regarding all of the facilities that have these attributes: unsignalized, certain number and certain combination of laneage and ADT. And now I'm going to pass it on to Rod to talk more about what are the steps that they are developing and that they have developed for the district to then use this preliminary list to refine it to a more specific list of locations that are a higher priority, and then how to use that to come up with potential countermeasures.
Great, thank you, Ofer. As Rachel mentioned at the beginning, and as Ofer was mentioning, our task here is to take the output of these tools and then identify specific actions for the Caltrans district safety investigators to take to reduce the probability of these collisions and improve pedestrian safety. The systemic tool that Offer showed groups the collisions by these various characteristics and highlights those with the highest number of collisions. We then use the output of the tool to create a list of locations on the Caltrans highway network that have similar characteristics. And those locations are prioritized for further analysis. And we do that both for the highway network as a whole and looking at it by district. Go on to the next slide. So after we've got these locations identified, we can then look at other factors to determine what should be prioritized. A key part of this is going to be applying some of the other work that Caltrans and SafeTrack have done to estimate pedestrian exposure at different locations across the state highway network. But we'll also pull in other factors to identify these priorities. These factors may range from proximity to schools, especially those with high percentages of students with free or reduced price meals. That's a factor that we use in California to identify disadvantaged community populations. It may include other indicators of disadvantaged communities, such as income below the state median. It could also include things like Cal Enviroscreen Screen. This is a tool used in California that pulls in various indicators of pollution burden and other population characteristics that are associated with vulnerability to pollution's health effects. And that's another measure that's used, especially within the California Active Transportation Program, to identify different disadvantaged communities. Another thing that we may look at is the areas where Caltrans has planned existing projects. So by getting out in front, by leveraging work that's already planned to be invested in these locations, we can identify specific improvements that can be made as part of the ongoing work that's planned on the state highway system. So we'll work to identify and prioritize these locations with the input of Caltrans and the various district safety investigators. You go on to the next slide. So we won't just give them locations. As Offer showed in the tool, he has developed some specific guidance that is tying countermeasures to the different crash characteristics. So we'll take the output of that, identify those remedies for each location, and provide the safety investigators a toolbox of how to apply those. For each location, they'll get this prioritized list of locations and the specific countermeasures that go with that location. It's important to note though, that this is not a recipe that can be then directly applied. It'll be important to have the safety investigators look at each location specifically, look at the unique characteristics of that, and apply the specific countermeasures that are most appropriate and that can be best applied in each location. It's important to have that specific engineering judgment and knowledge that goes into determining the remedies for each location to make sure that the best solution is made. And we're going to be providing each of the district safety investigators training so that they can apply these things appropriately. And with that, I'll wrap it up and hand it back to Dan.
Great, thanks so much. I appreciate all those presentations, a couple of really interesting examples from different sort of contexts and different settings depending on where people are coming from. I've got a slide that I'd like to put up now to help guide our discussion period, and we are going to get as many of these questions in as we can. Let me get the right slide up. What I have here are email addresses for all of our panelists, because I know that we probably won't get through every question. I do encourage you all to follow up with our panelists. If you're interested, we'd like to encourage you to follow up offline, maybe requesting some access to some of the files and materials that they shared, if they're willing to share them with you. One of the questions that just came in is actually a really nice blending together of the presentation. So let me pitch it to everybody and see who'd like to jump in first. Someone's asking, in performing these proactive systemic approaches, kind of looking at both of the examples and some of the guidance Rebecca shared, what are the factors that the different agencies should consider focusing on, and is the cross-tabulational analysis more effective than the regression-based analysis? I thought that was an interesting question, and I wonder if anyone would like to offer your thoughts on the different methods and when and where they might be most appropriate.
Well, I'll take a shot, Dan. This is Rebecca. Can everybody hear me okay? Dan, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, so that is a great question, and I'm not going to pretend like I have all of the answers. But one of the things that I want to just say in response to this is that that question is a great question for us to grapple with as a profession. I don't think we have an answer to it at this time, honestly. Part of that is because we're not able to, in many cases, do these sort of lovely controlled experiments that we might like to, where we say, okay, let's do this in one way and let's do this in another way, and then let's compare the results over time. And that's just because we don't have the resources to do that. So we have some situations where they're using one approach, some situations where they're using another approach. I don't think that we have an answer for you really as to which one is more effective. But what I would say is that I think this is where we need to, I want to go back to what we were talking about earlier with evaluation, which is that whatever approach you use, I hope that we all come away with this sort of imperative that we have to evaluate the success of those approaches. Of course, that's partly because we want to be able to tweak if we feel like we're not achieving the successes that we want to have, and that's explicit in the FHWA tool, that you need to evaluate and also tweak if you see that you're not achieving the results you desire. But also, again, so that we can share with each other, okay, this seemed to work really well in this circumstance, and it did not achieve what we were hoping in this circumstance. Let's work together as professionals, all concerned about safety, to try to see why we think some of this may have been more or less effective. So that's not a silver bullet answer, but I think it is a great question, and I hope that it spurs us to, again, sort of really put an emphasis on evaluation and on sharing our knowledge. I'm not sure, Chris, if you want to talk at all about specifically having used the SPF in Seattle, you might have some insights there, but I think generally speaking, we're still definitely in the sort of question phase.
Yeah, I would say that the SPF approach so far has been really good at pointing us in the right direction, but sometimes it's something that we already know about. Sometimes it's things that we really have to find the next step to see if why the model isn't lining up with the actual observed results. And sometimes it just points us in a direction where there's really not a lot going on. And so like Rebecca said, there's not a straight answer to that question, but we're still open to trying whatever approach is needed to fill in the gaps where our traditional approaches aren't taking us.
Great. Thank you. Any California? Yeah.
Yeah. So and I agree with both responses, and I want to add that first of all, the two methods are very similar, using similar data and similar concepts, so they're much more complementary than contradictory. One potential advantage of the more cross-tabulation approach is that if you're trying to implement a bigger program, it can be a state, it can be an MPO, it can also be a city. That's something that looks at kind of establishes an ongoing program, so it gives you a framework or benchmarking that's more structured for many years. That being said, you can also use the more detailed statistical analysis to look at a specific, what we're calling a cell, a specific systemic concern, if you have enough data, and then to do a more in-depth statistical analysis on top of that. And then the third comment is that a lot of the SPF, for the SPF, you need to have good exposure data. And if that's available, then that is something that can also be incorporated into the matrix or into the cross-tabulation. And when the California systemic analysis was first done, there was no exposure data, pedestrian exposure data across the state, so it was not taken into account. But that was actually, there was a model that now makes that data available, so then you can also dive deeper and incorporate also exposure and to some extent, maybe even safety performance functions into the cross-tabulation or matrix approach. So you can also combine both of these.
Well, thank you very much. I have a question building off of that, and I wonder from your perspective if agencies and individuals on the line today are interested in pursuing a systemic safety analysis. What do you see in terms of data needs? What do you see as being sort of the biggest hurdle data-wise for a lot of agencies, or getting a certain type of data into place as being maybe a challenge for getting to the point where they can do data analysis? And another way to ask the question is, if the agencies are thinking about getting their data in shape to prepare for systemic safety analysis, is it their crash data they should be focusing on? Is it the exposure or count data, volume data, these things? What would you suggest agencies begin to prioritize?
I would say it's twofold. Obviously, you need robust collision data that's consistent so that you can just compare it directly. But a lot of the carrying capacity from the actual analysis is to see how the things surrounding the collisions interact with it. Otherwise, you're just taking a collision density, collision frequency approach. So you do need to invest arguably more in things like your street network data set or things related to that than the collisions. But once again, if the collisions are your base, those need to at least have a schema that allows you to work off of it rather than just location.
Thank you very much. I have another question I wanted to get to. It's a bit technical, so I'll read it, and I believe Rebecca and Chris, maybe you can respond to this. But for the multivariate analysis in the Seattle study, how many observations were taken for negative binomial, for the negative binomial model if it is used, and the level of significance of the risk factors? What are those factors? This person didn't catch it and was just wondering if you could respond to that question. Hopefully that is not too confusing.
Chris, do you want me to take that, or do you want to take it?
You can take it. I need some clarification on what they mean by observations.
So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the person is asking just what were the numbers of observations we used in the models. And the answer is we created up several different models to look at pedestrian safety in various crash types for pedestrians, and also various crash types for bicyclists. And so the observations varied. The smallest that we have, we've written a couple of papers about this, and the smallest one that we profile at this time had number 462 observations in it. The largest had 2,570. So that largest one, that actually was a model that just looked at pedestrian safety at all intersections, and that was we didn't do anything more specific than that in terms of a crash type. The smallest one, 462, was looking specifically at the bicyclist traveling in the opposite direction with the motorist crash type at intersections. So you do have to have, a certain number of intersections to be able, or number of observations rather, to be able to say anything very meaningful about your data. In terms of significance level, we use the 95% cutoff. So anything with a p-value of 0.05 or lower was included in the model. And I'm happy to answer questions about that or forward papers offline if the person who is interested in that wants to follow up with me.
No, I think that helps answer the question. I have one more question for the group in California, and this may be speculative, and I don't know if Rachel, you're the right person to respond to this, but I think in a lot of states, people are still used to using crashes that have actually occurred to help justify spending safety dollars on safety projects. And I think the idea that we can spend safety and prioritize projects for safety dollars using predicted risk or sort of a proactive method is still a bit new for agencies. Are you seeing other states, and your state included, kind of moving in the direction of providing funding, not just for high crash, but high risk locations?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to give it a shot. So I think that one of the biggest factors for us in considering whether we would be funding proactive safety improvements through our safety program was FHWA's, so the Federal Highway Administration's guidance that they released on the ability to use highway safety improvement program funding on systemic safety. So written into the guidance on HSIP funds is the ability to use that money for systemic safety. I think that there's the way that we've set up our safety program historically and even up to now has really been based on collision histories. And so there's a lot of things, there's a lot of moving parts here. We're still, as Rebecca mentioned, learning how to do this analysis. We're still trying to figure out how, takeaways and what method works best, where we also have to learn about how to fund these systemic safety improvements. So potentially changes to our funding structure.
No, that's a great response. I do think that it's encouraging to see more of this work being done, and hopefully we can get to the point where we're looking at risk and doing necessary changes to our streets before crashes do happen. That's the ultimate goal here. So I appreciate all the work you all have done on this topic. I'm sad to say that we don't have any more time for questions, but I will encourage you again, please do reach out to us, reach out to our panel if you have further questions, and we can help you answer those. You will be getting an email from me later today that will have some information about the webinar today, some other resources, the recording for the session in case you want to review any of that. As you exit the webinar today, a very brief survey will greet you. I hope that you'll take just a moment to offer your ideas and thoughts on the webinar today and maybe some other ideas we might tackle in the future. A reminder that on October 30th, we will be back here talking about the rectangular rapid flashing beacon. So I hope you'll join us for that. And I just want to thank all of our panel members today for excellent presentations and their insight into this topic. Thanks to the Everyday Counts STEP program for sponsoring this webinar. And thanks to you all for joining today. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and we will see you next time.